Our chapel speaker today is Dipa Hart. Dipa serves as Assistant Director in Spiritual Formation and the Leadership Department, overseeing women's spiritual formation groups and women's internships. She has been a church planter and instructor at the Center for Biblical Studies and currently enjoys serving on her church's missions committee and remaining involved in a Christian sorority for college women, Sigma Phi Lambda. She and her husband, Nathan, have been married for 5 years. She enjoys traveling and going to movies and museums, and she listens to praise and worship music to calm her down in Dallas traffic. Rather good strategy, I suggest. Please join me in welcoming Dipa Hart to our chapel today.
Good morning. Thank you, and I do appreciate the opportunity to come and be with you this morning. I'd like to start with telling you about a story about Albert Einstein that I often heard growing up, especially when I got into trouble. My father would begin to recount how this famous scientist would take these long walks when he was deep in thought and trying to solve a problem. The story went that there was one time that Einstein was so deep in thought that he actually left his house naked. Stark naked, my father would begin to roar and start laughing. Well, the first time I heard that story, I came up with a good response. Dad, even the brightest people in the world do foolish things. But his response caught me off guard. If you were that bright, he said, you could do stupid things too. The message was subtle, but clear to me that day, and it's really never left my mind. I wasn't that bright. I wasn't. And so mistakes, foolish quirks, were not options for just people of average intelligence like me. So I must work harder to make up for my shortcomings, I was taught. Do more, try harder, spend several hours studying more than any of your peers, and stay up all night to perfect that paper. After all, I had expectations to live up to as an Indian immigrant. In a typical Indian home, mistakes are not events to learn from or seen as places of growth. They are only things to be embarrassed about, to be ashamed of, and considered failures. Never mention them again. Never bring them up. So I hid them, like everyone else, like everything else. I lived my life by flying underneath the radar and learned that risks were not to be rewarded. So second place was never a victory for me. It was a waste of time. A 92 wasn't a good grade. It was an F, and punishable in my home by grounding. And so on and it went. And so when I came to DTS and met Kate Turabian and discovered that Turabian was required to be flawless, it became another stupid thing that I secretly despised, and I grew angry. It was always the grader's fault. It was always everybody else's fault, especially Kate Turabian's. I didn't ask for help with my Greek. I wasn't about to admit that it was hard. No, I was determined to do it myself, late at night where no one could see that I struggled. Because naturally, I believed that if they found out just how hard it was, who I really was on the inside, they would realize that it was a total accident that they had let me in. After all, the Buddha does say, work out your own salvation. Do not depend on others. So it began somewhere in my childhood, where I learned that purpose of life was about being perfect. It came not only from the way my family viewed life as Hindu immigrants trying to make their life in a new country, but as Hindus who were working out our own salvation while trying to earn the American dream. It came not only from my family, but from the wealthy suburb of Dallas, where grades and academic excellence were paramount, and so were the legal over-the-counter drugs that everyone took to stay up all night studying. Excellence and the state of perfection were synonymous terms. Religiously and practically for me, life was about being perfect. It is the absence of flaws, Webster calls it, the ideal state that one is attaining to. To be honest, going from Hinduism to Christianity wasn't that big of a lifestyle change. The other Christians in high school, they were just like me. They worked just as hard like I did. And they looked good on the outside like I did. So looking back, I realized I subconsciously shifted my pursuit of being perfect to labeling it as a Christian pursuit of excellence. Armed it with the book of James, chapter 2, that faith without works is useless, I showed others my faith by how hard I worked at pursuing Christian excellence. My parents graciously raised us the best they knew how. And the seminary and the faculty and this administration who have so graciously asked me here today, they can't control our response to God. They work with what we bring to the table. No, I wholeheartedly knew I was a perfectionist, and it was a part of my life. So when I came to seminary, knowing this, I consciously took a stand against this ridiculous motto about the purpose of life was to be perfect. I was going to try to do better. In fact, it was during my first year here when I met this graduating student who was a little bit bitter, angry at some moments. God's school, whatever class he came from, or whatever he had to do, it was all frustrating and meaningless to this guy. He had about a month to go to graduation. To be completely honest, he frightened me. How could anyone leave this place like that, I wondered. And I didn't want to become him. So I determined I would just try harder. I would apply myself more, journal and pray every day for hours if that's what was needed. After all, I told myself my goal here was to learn about God, and that at the end of the day, if I just knew God more, I would be better off. Convinced myself for a brief time of this worthy pursuit. Convinced myself for a brief time that grades weren't so important. But to be honest again, it wasn't easy to make that switch so fast. So my perfectionism began to look like righteous procrastination. You know what righteous procrastination is. Waiting, humbly praying for, and expecting that moment of divine inspiration to just appear so that you were in the spiritual zone. Yeah, it never happened to me either. I just thought I was never spiritual enough. I would even make myself feel better after a hard test or a paper by thanking the Lord that it was all going to burn anyway and that it didn't matter. Eventually, some of the more seasoned students informed me that professors around here, they didn't buy into having to be in the spiritual zone to approach an assignment in the Bible. I was horrified. Apparently, they seemed to think they knew what we needed later on in ministry, and they actually expected assignments to help transform us. That I didn't have to be perfect to start answering and working on my homework, or even come up with the perfect product, but just willing to be transformed into the image of Christ, to be perfected by the Spirit through the process. But since old habits are hard to give up, the pendulum swung back to my old ways occasionally, and we went from righteous procrastination to perfectionistic workaholism. I started to ask my SF group how they were doing in their classes, but eventually I started comparing my grades to theirs, my life to their life. I certainly wasn't as smart as they were. Few of them had masters already. For every perfectionist workaholic, you see there's this expectation in us that there's a payoff at the end. Perhaps even a demand that after you spend countless hours on a paper, that you should receive an A. And so, when that B+ appeared, you would completely convince yourself that it was okay to argue with the professor, be angry with him, and demand for that A-. And so, we had it all figured out. The good news, though, for all of us workaholics, is that we do graduate. It is possible. And that's when the other expectations sit in, when we step into full-time ministry and expect that perfect position to be begging for us to grace their work. For us DTS grads, the perfect ministry is out there. It will realize our time and talents to be utilized in this perfect tension and proportion that God gave them to us in. It's where the church won't ever expect more than we can give, where our families won't compete with its needs, and the church, they'll always understand when I need a day off. The icing on the cake, though, the icing on the cake would be a salary that included more books, while meeting all of the family's financial needs of today with enough money for the kids' college education tomorrow. Never mind that most ministers in the world, including our own faculty, are bivocational or dual-income families. That's the job our perfectionism wants, the perfect job. The slacker and the workaholic, we're the same people. We both struggle with perfectionism. One's frozen by fear, and the other is driven to be successful at all costs. We both have the same problem. We behave like we are the ones in control of our own lives. We become our own gods. But in Christian excellence, God is our object of worship, not ourselves. A good slacker or workaholic are both perfectionists who have figured out how to make life work apart from God, how to get the A in the class and turn in the assignment, but not really have it affect us. Instead, we spend more energy and effort into living life perfectly as we know it, or complain as it should be, than just cooperating and allowing the Word to do its perfecting work or transforming us into the image of the suffering servant. The truth is, I liked the motto that life was about being perfect. It worked for me, and it was easy to nurture through seminary. And I did so until it slithered into every aspect of my soul. I thought I had given up this life about being perfect and was pursuing excellence, but I hadn't. I'm embarrassed to say that during those first few years, I justified my anger at the librarian when she couldn't find that book that should have been on hold. And it was never my fault that I missed that financial aid deadline. It was just too early in the spring semester to even think about. I suppose at some point, I just thought the world should revolve around me. After all, I was the one paying the tuition. But as I worked on my life story, and as a student and as an SF leader, I began to reflect more on the content of my classes. I became uneasy at how it revealed the ways I was living today were no different than the ways I had lived before I was redeemed. I still lived a life where I worshiped and trusted only myself. My life story has always been easy to share with others. I was always affirmed or looked compassionately at. No, what really got my attention was during my first SF experience. I was the student that was skipping the day we shared our personal Screwtape letters. I had to do homework. The personal Screwtape letter is an exercise where you write to yourself what a demon would say. Between two demons, the conversation about how to get you. I was frozen to even think about sharing my own sin. I wrote the letter, but I couldn't share it. Luckily, the group was aware that unless it was 2 a.m., I wasn't doing my homework, and they pursued it. In fact, nearly 10 years later, they still do. I was already having a faith crisis my first few years at seminary. I realized that nothing I had ever taught or ever shared was ever right. Now, I was having a Christian identity crisis. I knew who I wasn't, but who was I supposed to be? And what on earth did that look like? Luckily, however, I did always go to class like a good perfectionist, like someone who was always trying to earn their way, occasionally late. I discovered that the book of James was written to the dispersed Jewish believers who were having the same problems. They were quarreling about what was sin. They couldn't tell what it meant to be mature, or even how to talk with each other. I liked James' simple and clear answer. Turn with me to the book of James for a few minutes, chapter 2. I'd like to read the passage about works that I mentioned earlier. Beginning with 2:18. James chapter 2:18. What use is it, brethren? That's 2:14. Let's start with 2:18. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that man is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Before I had used the concept in James, without works, that faith without works is useless to justify my life, that my life was supposed to be about works and being perfect. Now the rest of the passage, as I read it and began to study it seemingly for the first time, I began to realize it's not exactly the application James had in mind. In verse 20, when it says that you believe that God is one, you do well. The demons also believe and shudder. I tripped, metaphorically speaking. The demons knew God was one. Well, I knew God was one, but I believed God. How was I looking any different than a demon? What were the good works that showed my faith? I realized I wasn't striving for good works that perfected my faith. In fact, some of those good works were driving me away from God. I was striving for myself to appear excellent in all of my courses. I was striving for being seen as perfect and not allowing myself to be perfected in the image of Christ. Taking a look at Abraham and Rahab, applying those Bible observation methods, I finally got a different framework and developed a hope. Two people who I thought had nothing in common. Abraham was a holy patriarch of our heritage who spoke with God's messengers personally, and he was on a holy mission. But Rahab, the local prostitute of Jericho, she was shrewdly trying to provide for her family by renting out a room to a couple of Israelite spies. The only thing she knew about God was that she had heard something about waters parting and the destruction of other kings and cities, and she was afraid. Both, however, encountered this crisis. Rahab responded by lying to her king and sheltering spies against her own city to keep her family safe before the looming war. Abraham, though, was trying to obey his king. He was sacrificing his future, his most beloved son. And I have to wonder if everything in him wasn't screaming, Lord, am I just not spiritual enough that you would ask me to do this? Both, in their times of crisis, responded by showing their trust was not that their trust was not about themselves. It was not in themselves. They both responded by showing that their trust was in God, and it was visible by how they acted. It was not their actions that earned them friendship with God. It was their actions that revealed they were already friends with God. They figured out that life was not about being perfect. It was about being perfected. The process of allowing their lives to be used by God to bless others. In this case, it was God's chosen people. R.C. Sproul summarizes the book of James by stating that our prayers are worthless if they do not result in the care of people. To care for people, allowing God to use crisis as he did for Abraham and Rahab to bless others, means that we daily have to give up being perfect and will have to be content with being perfected, that our brokenness and our pain and struggles must become available to God to use to bless others. On a website for ex-Christians, the following quote from a book entitled Losing Faith in Faith reads, Christianity, is a counterfeit love that is contingent upon authority, punishment, and reward. True love is respect and admiration, compassion and kindness, freely given by a healthy, unafraid human being. Somewhere, as that author left the Christianity he knew, that he had come to expect was normal, he figured out what he was longing for: love from an unafraid human being. The problem is, you and I are too afraid to be honest to love. I have always believed in the value of authenticity. I really have. And it's the latest buzzword in all of our churches. I just wasn't sure that it was something I was called to do all the time with everyone. Maybe just a few select needy people, I often told myself. After all, if I tried out what James said, it meant that life is not about being perfect, but about being perfected. And that meant I would have to risk. I don't like taking risks. I would have to trust God and to care well for people. I love the world of spiritual formation and servant leadership over in Hendricks. In some ways, I've been given the opportunity to serve in a dream position that utilizes me well, except for that book stipend. I'm still working on that book stipend. My position. The night before it was offered to me, I had told my husband, Nathan, I didn't think I should take the job. That I didn't feel like I had earned the privilege to work at DTS. Had they seen my transcript? That I didn't feel like I was good enough because I wasn't the model. I wasn't a model anything to anyone, it seemed. And then if it was offered to me, I just felt like the Lord was leading me to say no. Lucky for me, I am married to someone who occasionally talked to God, too, and was just as blunt at some times. So when he responded, if God didn't want you to have this job, I'm not sure he would have offered it to you. It began several hours of conversation about whether or not God would give us gifts, talents, the time, and then the opportunity to use them, but not want us to respond to them. It sounds absurd. I know it does. But the truth is, I didn't want the job because I knew I couldn't do it perfectly. I knew I would have to be real with a lot of people that would graduate and I would never see again. Who would they tell about my sin? Who were they going to tell about my flaws? I would surely embarrass God and ruin the seminary somehow. I would certainly get fired and never work in ministry again. I wondered if they would take back my diploma. It took me a few weeks to bring it up. That's when the department told me that I wasn't expected to be a 60-year-old saint who had it all together, but just me. I actually went home and cried out in a humble kind of anger. The next day, when I was told that the expectations for my first year was to get used to my job, was to get used to being out of seminary and make it my own. These weren't measurable goals, I mumbled to God. Welcome to real life, was what I heard back. I have discovered that on the outside, where I couldn't measure my godliness by my grades at the end of the semester. There wasn't a way to measure my godliness. There weren't papers to produce, checklists to consult, my DTS to figure out. People, real people, weren't widgets to be produced. They were people to be cared and loved for. I like best the way the actress and non-Christian Audrey Hepburn phrases it. People, even more than things, have to be restored, renewed, revived, reclaimed, and redeemed. Never throw out anyone. It's easy here to give into perfectionism and exchange your spiritual life for a spiritual grade. It's easy to not journal, not consider God in all of your ways. Most of us are just trying to survive the last few days of the month where there's $20 in our checking account. Get the next paper turned in since we procrastinated over spring break. We're not considering coming face to face with the exhaustion and intention we feel deep inside our spirits. I know what you're thinking. You will figure it out at the end of the semester, but you'll keep saying that. All of the other alumni, we all kept saying it. We'll figure it out at graduation. Nope. Just didn't have the time then. You won't have the time later. I've seen countless articles, stories and statistics on burnout, exchanging the purposes of our life to glorify God with doing everything flawless, and might I add, lacking joy and completely being burned out and exhausted. Nathan and I are statistics ourselves. 3 weeks after graduation, we were ready to call it quits over a faltering church plant that years ago we weren't a part of, trying to help grasp authenticity. We were part of the problem. And even though it was a core value, it never was fully realized back then. So we've spent the last few years on the back pews of another church that we now call home, quietly letting the most wonderfully flawed community group minister to us, love on us. If you had told me that our ministry assignment right after seminary would have included not leading, but receiving care from others for ourselves, I would have thrown Kate Turabian at you. What I realized is our community group isn't just a group of recovering perfectionists. No, we're all in that process of being used by the Spirit to perfect each other. Sometimes it doesn't feel good. Other times it does. To all my Greek and Hebrew friends who took their proficiency exams more than once, truly, languages have been very helpful in all the teaching and all the work that you're going to do afterwards. But the number one reason that it was so good for me spiritually, I had to get a tutor. I was terrified that day I walked into Mitchell. I completely expected to be insulted and ridiculed because I couldn't parse the paradigm. I had been many times on many papers before. But it turned out that Dr. Wallace didn't do well in Greek either his first time. So I thought it might be okay this once just to ask for help. That's when I realized there was actually a waiting line for the tutors. If you haven't figured it out yet, let the exhaustion in your bones tell you, life is not about being perfect. It's about being perfected. It's about allowing your faith to become life for others and not a deadly virus. Choose life. Anna Quinlan, the 1992 Pulitzer Prize journalist, writes, "The thing that is really hard and really amazing is giving up on being perfect and beginning the work of becoming yourself. In that process of being perfected, you are the spam that is being processed in the heavenly factory. It is painful and gross, and yes, it is a lot of work in response to God, but it creates a faith that gives life. Choose life. You can choose to not just finish the assignment to get the grade and to pass the class, but to dig into the study and allow God to transform you. But I warn you, my fellow procrastinators, you will have to choose to work ahead and give up your late night ways. And I warn you, my fellow workaholics, you will have to slow down and not be concerned with getting the perfect grade, but be concerned with transforming into the person who will love others because he first loved us. Henry Nouwen states, much of their urgency comes from our own need to be accepted and affirmed. You have to keep going back to the source, God's love for you. God does not want you to destroy yourself. Exhaustion, burnout, and depression are not signs that you are doing God's will. It is not easy to give your agenda to God, but the more you do, the more clock time becomes God's time. And God's time is always the fullness of time. You will have to give up your pride and to be honest about where you are. You will have to allow your pain to be a tool in someone else's life. You will have to give up that academic agenda and exchange it for God's purpose. You will have to give up asking others about their grades and instead ask what they learned about God's character. Not who was the easiest professor to take or the most knowledgeable about the subject, but whose teaching style and methodology would communicate to my personality what I needed to hear about God in this area. I can tell you that it's better to give it up earlier, to stop worshiping at your own throne and pretending to be in control. He's in charge anyway, and you're gonna lose that battle sooner or later. So you will have to change your prayers from, Lord, use this in spite of me, to God, please be glorified through me. Not my will, but yours be done was not a command. It was an act of submission, an act that produced your life and mine. And our lives are painful examples and broken stories that this broken world desperately needs to hear so that they know where to find where they can be loved and accepted. I know that my parents, they never meant to hurt me. For them, good works redeems their life. And so we were taught perfection, perfect good works were the best way to live. But for us, whose lives have been redeemed, you have a choice. I beg you, and I implore you, choose life. Thank you.